Anyways, yeah, I am Mike Munoz. I've been a ranger here for 20 something years. And prior to becoming a ranger, I was involved with fire in terms of suppression quite a bit. And so I was really glad to be able to come to a district where I had the chance to get going on something different. I read a quote recently: brain studies have shown that may have been hardwired to focus on problems rather than or at the expense of a positive vision. And what I hope to do here today is to share not only a positive vision, but a vision that is and continues to be acted upon. So go ahead, Natalie, next slide. I can't, this is difficult. So two major things I hope to share in this moment are that managing wildfires for benefit is not theoretical, and that benefit fires create resilient ecosystems. And we need more research at the large landscape level, looking at a relic like the Bob Marshall Complex or on the Rocky Mountain District, as well as on the Spotted Bear District, although they've had a little more research going on than we certainly have experienced. Otherwise, you're simply going to continue to hear my biased anecdotal observations on what we have going on. And I do want to emphasize a quote that Don Gayton shared with us as a keynote speaker. And he said, "The more often it burns, the less damage it does." Next slide, Natalie. So now you're looking at a map that is known as our fire history map. Yeah, to give you some reference points, up in the top end is Glacier Park and the Blackfeet Reservation, and clear down on the bottom end is near Highway 200. The wilderness areas in here that are designated are the Great Bear, Bob Marshall, and Scapegoat, and they comprise about 1.6 million acres or 640,000 hectares. And if you take in the National Forest System land outside the designated wilderness, you have about 3 million acres or about 1.2 million hectares. And to help a little more with scale, as you see the amount of fire activity we've had over these last several decades, it's about 193 kilometers from north to south, or 120 miles. And from east to west, National Forest System lands, it's about 60 miles or 95 kilometers. And in the last 20 years, we finally started to realize substantial benefits of second and third entry fire events building on initial entries, amounting to nearly 3 dozen fuel-limited fire events overlapping in the last 20 years. Next slide. So in this diagram, what we're showing, and I'm just going to make sure you got the right one. Thank you, Natalie. We're showing 3 different eras, and this particular segment is a portion of the Spotted Bear District on the Flathead National Forest, so west of the divide from where I'm located on the east side. And it's about 700,000 acres of the 1 million acre Bob Marshall Wilderness. And essentially what you see is pre-contact on the left there in 1889 through 1934, where we had quite a bit of fire activity before we came along in terms of our fire management, which was suppression. In the middle there, you see where we were highly effective with fire suppression and essentially excluded fire having the same effects as prior that were demonstrated on the left there. And a lot of this had to do with some wet decades in the 70s and 80s, as well as when we switched over from fire lookouts predominantly to air patrols that made it much easier to detect fires. And of course, we had a lot more people on the ground too. And as you look at the right there, that's when we began what we call managing fire for benefit, previously called prescribed natural fire, as well as wildland fire use. And so we have the date of 1981 because that's when the first plan was written, and it's when we really got going. And the thing I want you to take away from this is simply that we're essentially practicing what used to be present on the landscape in this fire-adapted Northern Rockies, or as Ian Dyson would say, where the Southern Rockies of Canada meet the Northern Rockies of the US. Next slide. And we're standing on the, whoops, I didn't change my slide. And we're standing on the shoulders of those who preceded us. They had a vision of the vitality of fire, having had a lot of experience with it, and came up with this plan in '81, as well as the Bob Marshall Fire Plan in '83. And those plans were preceded by the 1972 White Cap Fire Plan down in the Salway Bitterroot, which was 1972. These plans allowed us in an era when we were still putting out a lot of fires to start managing for benefit. And they had a hard go the first couple of decades because they only got fires that were 1/10 of an acre here and 10 acres there and 20 acres there. But that all changed in 1988. And Brian shared with you a lot from Yellowstone of '88. And of course, we experienced the 245,000 acre fire in 1988, known as the Canyon Creek Fire. Now, what this plan did was allow us to manage fire or natural processes. And we did everything possible that we could to keep fire in wilderness. But today we're expanding beyond wilderness, recognizing much more. Next slide. And one of the benefits I've noted, based on my biased anecdotal observations, relates to soil water holding capacity. We conduct snow surveys every year at the end of February, March, and April. And based on my anecdotal observations, the resulting change of the landscape is revealing a myriad of snowpack accumulation conditions. And as you look at this slide, it's in the North Fork Sun River country, and it has multiple of fire events, but this one's really focused on the red shale fire. And it's showing a diversity in species, a diverse age class in tree species, and an arrangement of fuels and vegetation on the landscape that's having an effect, from what I can see, on snow accumulation, and it's creating a myriad of snow melt rates and resulting runoff events, rather than everything coming off all at once. Next slide. And what that led me to, of course, is one of the greatest connections I've seen in regards to current and future wildland fire management for benefit. And it's displayed here succinctly as a result of our sister agency, the NRCS. So basically what it's showing is that for every 1% of organic matter that you can get into the soil on 1 acre, you can increase that 1 acre's ability to hold 25,000 gallons of water. And how much more with charcoal, which I added there on the left. And in my mind, what we're looking at here is that the Creator has already put in place. All we need to do is re-acknowledge and adapt. And what better time to do so in the era of climate change, when we're receiving a lower amounts of snowpack, and what snowpack we do get has less water content, and it's running off way earlier in the spring. Next slide. These next several slides are of reoccurring wildfire. In this case, you have the red shale fire of 2013, which was about 13,000 acres. And it's reoccurring in the Gates fire of 1988, the same year that Canyon Creek burned. And it was a 55,000 acre fire. This re-entry fire, second entry, required little to non-existent management actions on all multiple fire fronts. And today there are 3 age classes of multiple tree species in this picture, rather than simply 1 age class awaiting another large-scale stand replacement fire event. Next slide. The 1988 fire, which was largely stand replacement, had quite an aftermath of downfall. And within 12 to 15 years, it also had oodles of lodgepole pine regeneration. It's the downfall that largely became the charcoal reintroduced to the soil regime with the second entry fire 25 years later. Next slide. These second and third entry fires tend to move slow enough to consume or convert the large diameter downfall. And it converts it to charcoal, as you can see here, yet cool enough to allow the Doug fir regeneration in this mixed conifer stand to survive as a seed source. Next slide. Multiple wildfire events and large-scale prescribed fire across an extensive landscape are contributing substantial charcoal to the soil biome. Remember, 1%, 1 acre, 25,000 gallons, or 95,000 liters for you Canadians. Next slide. In many ways, I'm not too sure we could improve upon this particular wildfire event with prescribed fire. Although large-scale prescribed fire remains a crucial practice for us, we completed a 16,000-acre landscape prescribed fire in wilderness in the Scapegoat, and we're planning another ignition of 10,500 acres along the National Forest private land boundary near Augusta, in the remnants of the 1988 Canyon Creek fire, which was 245,000 acres. Next slide. These next couple of photos pretty much indicate that third entry wildfire will likely be readily supported as time moves along. You can see this 1 year later in the Red Trail fire. And next slide. And essentially what mixed severity fire looks like a year later, and the resulting vegetative landscape that has many more benefits that I'll mention in the next couple of slides. However, before we go to the next slide, I just want to point out here, this is 1 year later. It had some stand regeneration that it took out. It consumed a lot of logs, getting them converted to charcoal into the soil. But if you look in the background there, you see green tints. That's not regeneration there. That's trees that survived the '88 fire. They survived the 2013 fire, and they're going to be great seed sources for the coming years. And who knows what's going to happen when we get the third entry fire along this area. So now on to the other benefits. Next slide. And you talk about patience. It's just some more biased anecdotal observations on my part. But this is an area of the 2007 Fool Creek wildfire that was managed for benefit. It originated in the wilderness in the Bob, and when it came out, we continued to manage it as a benefit fire outside the wilderness. And here in the North Fork Teton River that you see, it resulted in substantial fish kill of West Slope cutthroat trout during and immediately following the fire event. And there were quite a bit of fish out of this canyon that came floating downriver, and it was quite a stark deal. Our fish biologist had some pretty watery eyes when he got a chance to see that. But much like the patience of my daughter learning to fly cast here in the Teton. Next slide. The West Slope cutthroat trout not only returned the next year, but in a few years were no longer mere 8 to 10 inch fish, which was predominantly what occurred prior to the fire event, but rather whopping 16 inches like my son is holding, and plentiful. Perhaps the resulting benefits of increased nutrient flows. But there I go again with my biased anecdotal observations. Next slide. And talk about some more benefits. Some people saw this as an impact. And this is one of those places where I get to share with you someone else's biased anecdotal observations. This Teton Pass ski area, the area to the right there is called No Name Ridge. The ski area had plans in their master plan to glade that No Name Ridge so they could create some great powder skiing. While the fire came along burning fairly intensely, intense enough that there weren't any branches left on the standing dead snags remaining. But it took care of it in one burn period. And that winter and the following winter, we had powder hounds from Bozeman come up and ski it. And they wrote some great articles in the Great Forest Tribune that indicated clearly how great an experience it was and that it was some of the best they had had. So again, a benefit or an impact. Next slide. And all the more so we're starting to see with recreation and trails. After the '88 fires in both Canyon Creek and Gates Park, this is what we typically were dealing with the aftermath. It took a lot of patience, but we're finally at a place now where we're seeing benefits of fire clearing this up, making it far easier for us to clear trails rather than go back 4 or 5 times in one season to clear the same trail. And it's benefiting both the public at large as well as our outfitter guide commercial operations. Next slide. Oftentimes, when you look at a picture like this, some of my coworkers would ask, is there a point that we have too much fire? And when I look at this particular picture, the trees, the snags in the foreground, there are a result of the '88 fire. In the background are trees that are essentially part of a stand of a decadent area that did not burn. It's essentially falling apart, it's unhealthy, and it's begging for fire to renew it. And in the Bob Marshall complex and surrounding wildlands, we're in a far better place today as a result of managing wildfire for benefit. And how much more so if we had started in the 1950s? And many people oftentimes are asking, is it too late? Well, if the best time to begin wildland fire management for benefit was 50 years ago, the next best time I would say is upon us. And it's going to occur whether we participate or not. Next slide. I was really glad to hear Sarah and Peter talk quite a bit more on smoke and air quality. It's one of the key things that we always jump on as we get ready to manage both prescribed fire at a large landscape level and second and third entry fires. So it's a routine for us to go to the AFDN region and get monitors and sensors so we can have them set up. And they actually send people to set them up. And the smoke monitors, next slide, sorry. And the smoke monitors allow us to essentially provide live data that's readily accessible to the public. And it further demonstrates the benefits of managing fire in second and third entry. It's really one of the better ways for us to continually tell the public and political representatives why we do what we do. Next slide. And most importantly, for myself, and I'm sure for many more agency administrators or representatives, is that we can't emphasize enough safety. Safety in strategies that lead to tactics on the ground or in the air well ahead of chaos. And as you look at this photo, you can see these fire personnel wrapping an administrative site quite calmly, well ahead of the fire. And I just have to say that it's one of the greatest experiences I have in managing wildfire for benefit, is not having chaos and people taking actions that are unnecessarily exposing them to unnecessary risk. And one thing I would share is a couple of years ago, Wildland Fire magazine published a story on fatalities. Between the years of 1990 to 2015, they reported there were 450 plus fatalities on wildfires, wildland fires, and not prescribed fires and certainly not house fires, but wildland fires. And when they took a look at those fatalities, all of them were on suppression fire events. Not a single one was a benefit fire, not a prescribed natural fire, not wildland fire use. Next slide. And this is an aerial photo of that cabin that was wrapped. The cabin's wrapped, the tack shed is wrapped, even the outhouse was wrapped. Hose lays were laid around the perimeter, outside near the tree line, with Mark III pumps and daisy chained on the fuel cans. And 7 days later, next slide, the fire event came through. Fire personnel started up the Mark IIIs, and we pulled them out of there before the fire front got to the area, and it survived. And not only did it survive, but surrounding trees survived as well. Next slide. So one of the things that often people think is when we're managing fire for benefit, they turn back to this old term. I don't even remember the old term because I got it out of my system. But one of the key things that I want to focus on just with this slide is that it still takes some active management. We on the Helena, Lewis, and Clark, as well as over on the Flathead, depend quite a bit on air resources to help us. Help us when we're looking at our contingency plans. And we always have contingency plans when we're managing fires for benefit, because we know not everything's going to go just perfect. And they allow us to carry out certain actions that we identify way ahead of time, much like wrapping that cabin, or taking action with doing water drops, or even using retardant at times if necessary to reduce intensity or to redirect a fire. Next slide. This is a picture of one of the earlier fires, actually my first fire that I managed as a ranger or agency administrator for benefit. It's the Big Splat Fire of 2001. And the thing about this fire that I realized when I first started was that we took more actions on this fire to keep it in the wilderness than we took on any fires practically to put them out. And we had to do that at the time because of the plan that we had that essentially had fire exclusion zones as well as maintaining fire only in wilderness for natural processes. But we've come a long way since then. We're focused more on ecological benefit as well as social benefit. And we're no longer concerned with arbitrary wilderness boundaries. We're managing fire outside. Up in the Badger Two Medicine Country, we've had several fires that we've managed. It's all outside the wilderness. And we're doing even more so as time goes on. Next slide. What I'm showing you here is another benefit that a lot of folks tend to focus on when it comes to fire. On the top in the blue is the Red Shale Fire, and at 13,000 acres, that was managed for $850,000 or $65 an acre. Fire below in the green was our South Fork Sun Prescribed Fire that was 16,000 acres. We pulled that off in 3 phases. It cost $1 million. It was $63 an acre. The Ahorn Fire in the middle there in the black was 52,000 acres. We tried to put it out. It did what it was going to do anyways, and we spent $20 million. $20 million at $377 an acre. That Fool Creek Fire that I talked about earlier was the same year as Ahorn Fire. The Fool Creek Fire, like I said, was managed for benefit, even when it came out of the wilderness. And we managed that for $4 million. It was a 60,000 plus acre fire, and it was $65 an acre. So costs are certainly something to consider, and we certainly can do a lot better when we're getting to second and third entry fire events. And even more so, I believe, when we start to get to fourth entry fire events. Next slide. This last slide, I'm just going to double check that. All right, thank you, Natalie. This last slide is just some wildfire isms that typically shared during public meetings, and we get lots of them when we have fire management going on. I'm not going to read these to you. I'll allow you just to pick out a couple and read them. But what I would simply ask in today's climate change, are we really able to delay fire? Have we been successful with past strategies regarding suppression? Should we simply hope for a quiet fire year? Connecting people both near and far to short-term and long-term benefits remains necessary. And what better story that all people can relate to in managing wildfire for benefit than the short-term and long-term benefits to water and air. Lastly, we have one heck of a large scale level, large landscape level experimental fire laboratory readily available for your research scientists. And we're itching for you to come out, gather data, and that will become the next set of historical records. Essentially what we got in the Bob Marshall complex and surrounding landscape is a relic landscape, I think, that's repeating what used to happen before we interfered with how wildfire often renewed the landscape. And that's it. I do have one little, next slide if you want. I do have one little story to end with here, I guess, before we go to questions. This happened during the 2007 fire year. We were doing some briefings. I was in the office, got this fax from an individual up in Sun Canyon. He had an inholding up Sun Canyon. It's one of the few inholdings we have, and I'll read it to you. I'm at milepost number 33, Mortimer Gulch. We were told that we could go to lower campground to get a drink of water. My question is, can we take a shit while we are there? I read that note and immediately grabbed a pen and I wrote back, Dear Mike Stevens, apparently you need to. Thank you for your note. Faxed it back to him. Went back to getting prepared for a briefing and got a phone call. And the lady at the front desk said, I think this is the individual you just faxed back. I got on the phone expecting to get an earful, but the individual said, I sure am glad to know you got a sense of humor. And that's one of the key things to keep on with doing the positive things we're doing with fire management. And that's it.
Anyway, amazing, amazing. I know I'm going to watch that many times over, and just looking at all of those photos are incredible. So really appreciate that. I know you're going to tell me we don't know. I just have to ask. So this idea about 1% of organic matter added to an acre increases the storage capacity by 25,000 gallons. Do we understand what kind of organic matter, like 1%, 10%, what is laid down in some of these fires, depending on severity or forest type? Do we have any kind of way to understand what's happening in the forest?
At this point, I haven't seen a lot of research that's looked into that, especially with charcoal. That's why I was so interested when Laurie Daniels brought up the phytoliths and how they can take a look at different silica for different species, but more so from the standpoint of recording charcoal in soil and understanding how, and I forgot to say this, but you know, biochar is a big deal. They're taking a lot of time to cut trees, incinerate trees, and move that biochar to agricultural fields, and it's working. And what better way than for us to have that occurring as a natural process? So no, I haven't seen a lot of science, and that's why I'm indicating that with our second and third entry fires on both sides of the divide in Flathead and Helena, Lewis and Clark Forest, there's a great opportunity. Fortunately, we have Cameron Nassify, who used to be up there in Alberta, but is now over in Oregon and coordinating, I believe, with U of M, and he'll be starting some research on us, and he's getting more excited about the whole water situation too.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to pipe in on the amount of charcoal created in different types of fires, and it's something. This is Adrian Leslie talking. I manage some property in the West Kootenays, and it's an area that I've been just doing a little bit more research on this past winter because it does seem to have a lot of potential, and just for a number of different reasons, as Mike talked about there. But yeah, I don't think there is a lot of research on different amounts of charcoal created in different fire severities, and there's a little bit out there on prescribed fire versus wildfire, but it's certainly an area ripe for a lot more research and a lot of potential, and something I'm going to start looking at as one of our targets when we're doing prescribed burn and managed wildfires is to maximize the amount of charcoal created. So I sort of put that out there as something that certainly I'm interested in. So.
Well, and definitely, you know, one of the key things for me is to try to find benefits for public that never will see the landscape. And down here in the US, 70% of our water comes from National Forest System lands all across this contiguous US. And what better thing to focus on? Here on the front, we have multiple canal companies. I don't doubt it's the same up north. And we have multiple reservoirs that are for farming strictly. And of course, our NRCS snow surveys are primarily to inform shipping up the Mississippi that they collect. And so what better way than to focus on water? And we're already got some good focus on smoke going on, and we need to continue that. And we add water to it, it's going to be great.